Elaine adjusted her glasses with a trembling hand. The lenses were old, the frame slightly bent at the hinge. But she refused to replace them. They were hers, and so was the battered folder pressed tightly to her chest, a dull gray file jacket. She'd kept for nearly 12 years. Inside it lay everything that mattered. Everything she had left. The courthouse lobby hummed with quiet chatter and echoing footsteps. It smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow that made every wrinkle on her face more visible. Elaine took a shallow breath. Then another. She whispered the judge's name under her breath, the way one might repeat a word in a new language, trying to desensitize it. Judge Theodore Langston. She knew that name long before this lawsuit. Long before her name was scrubbed from the company directory at Levon and Harlan Incorporated. Before the HR manager couldn't find her records. Before they stopped returning her calls. 12 years ago, Langston wasn't a judge. He was just another lawyer in the firm. Back then, Elaine had been more than a secretary. She'd managed logistics, coordinated international contracts, held entire departments together while executives came and went like changing seasons. She was trusted. Invisible, yes, as women her age often were in corporate settings, but trusted until she wasn't. The court officer called her case number. Elaine stood. Her knees wobbled slightly. She clutched the folder tighter and began the long walk into the courtroom. No lawyer flanked her. No entourage followed. Just the echo of her sensible shoes on the tile floors inside. The courtroom was cold. Too cold. The kind of cold that made you wish you'd worn a thicker sweater, or maybe a scarf. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the atmosphere. The judge sat elevated, in dark robes, thumbing through documents with mechanical indifference. Across the aisle, her former employer's legal team chatted in low tones, polished and confident. One of them looked barely 30. Elaine stood behind the plaintiff's table. Her name, handwritten on the sign-in sheet outside, looked small and shaky. Judge Langston looked up. His face twitched, maybe recognition, maybe irritation. Miss Shepherd, he said, in a tone that carried no warmth. You're representing yourself? Yes, Your Honor, she said, her voice thin, almost swallowed by the room. There was a pause. The judge leaned back slightly, lifting one brow. You realize this is a civil case involving company property and corporate liability claims? I do, she replied. He sighed, not loud, but enough for the court recorder to catch the air shift. Then, under his breath but audible enough for her to hear, he chuckled. It was the kind of chuckle people used when they didn't think you had a chance. A tired laugh. Dismissive. Elaine's face flushed. Her throat tightened. Her voice, always soft, often shaky, faltered even more as she continued. I was an employee of Levon and Harlan from 2004 until 2013. I was quietly removed from internal records without warning, despite no formal termination, and no severance. Langston looked down at the documents in front of him. One of the corporate attorneys stood. Your Honor, we'd like to move to dismiss the suit based on the plaintiff's inability to provide sufficient employment documentation. Elaine opened the folder. Her hands weren't trembling anymore. She reached in and pulled out a single page. It had yellowed slightly with age, but the ink was bold. A company memo, dated 2011, with internal routing notes, and a clear, unmistakable signature. At the bottom, she held it up. I'd like to submit this as evidence, she said. The judge looked up. Something in his posture shifted. Approach the bench, he said. She walked slowly, deliberately. The courtroom fell silent. Even the young lawyer stopped mid-sentence. Elaine handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Langston took it. His eyes scanned the page. He froze. There, in black ink, was his own name, his own signature. At the time, he had been serving as in-house legal counsel. And this memo, this page Elaine had kept for over a decade, clearly acknowledged her role in authorizing cross-departmental staff transfers. It confirmed not only her employment but her position of trust within the company. The silence in the courtroom thickened. Langston stared at the page longer than necessary. He didn't speak. Elaine returned to her table and sat, her hands now resting calmly on the folder's edge. The judge finally cleared his throat. Motion to dismiss is denied. The corporate lawyers exchanged glances. Elaine didn't smile. She didn't need to. The folder sat quietly before her, the years of silence and invisibility compressed into a single sheet of undeniable truth. She had been laughed at. Now, no one made a sound. Elaine sat at the edge of her bed that night, staring at the stack of papers spread out across her comforter. Her knees ached. Her lower back throbbed, a reminder of the hours she'd spent seated upright in the courtroom, her spine tight with anticipation and restraint. But her mind wouldn't rest. She thought she'd feel something different after today. Relief, maybe. A spark of vindication. But instead, she felt a strange quiet. Like something had cracked open, and now everything she'd kept buried for over A decade was finally leaking out. She reached over to her nightstand, where a half-finished cup of tea had gone cold. Next to it sat a small digital recorder, cheap, plastic, bought secondhand from a thrift store near her apartment. She'd brought it to court with the idea that she might want to record her own reflections afterward. But now, with the courtroom behind her and the echo of the judge's words still humming in her ears, she wasn't sure what to say. She clicked it on anyway. "This is Elaine Shepherd," she said softly. July 10th. First hearing done. They didn't laugh when it ended. She paused. He recognized his signature. He didn't say it. But he saw it. And I saw him see it. The recording clicked off. That was enough for tonight. The next morning, Elaine found herself back at the public library, seated at her usual table by the dusty window in the back corner. This had become her makeshift office over the past few months. She couldn't afford legal counsel, and legal aid had been overwhelmed with cases. But the library had free Wi-Fi, an old scanner, and just enough quiet to concentrate. She sifted through more folders. Old performance reviews, inter-office memos, forgotten birthday cards from coworkers, anything with a date, a signature, a name. She'd become an archivist of her own erasure. Every detail mattered now. She had learned that the hard way. Across the table sat her friend Tamara, a retired nurse she'd met at a community support group for older women re-entering the workforce. Tamara had a firm, pragmatic way about her. No nonsense. But also deeply kind. "So?" Tamara said, sipping from a chipped thermos. "How'd it go?" Elaine exhaled. He tried to dismiss it right away. Smiled like I was a child playing court. "But you got it admitted?" "I did." She looked up. He saw his name. He couldn't deny it. Tamara nodded slowly. "Good. That's good." Elaine hesitated. "But they're going to come harder now. They won't underestimate me next time." Tamara leaned back. "They'll try to shake you. Discredit you. Make it about something else." Elaine nodded. "I've read the strategy. Delay. Disorient. Drain resources. Make the plaintiff give up." "And will you?" Elaine didn't answer right away. She stared down at a photo she had clipped to the corner of her notes, a picture from the company picnic in 2010. She was standing near a grill, her hands stained with barbecue sauce, laughing. That version of herself looked tired, but happy. Visible. "I gave them 13 years of my life," she said finally. "I just want them to say it happened. That I existed there." Tamara placed a hand over Elaine's. "Then you don't. Let them rewrite it." 3 days later, Elaine received an official document in the mail, a formal response from Levon and Harlan's legal team. It arrived in a thick envelope stamped with embossed letters. She slid it open with care, unfolding page after page of dense legalese. She scanned until she saw it, a motion to disqualify the submitted evidence, citing procedural irregularities and potential misrepresentation of the documents. Chain of custody. Elaine's heart sank. They weren't just going to argue against her case. They were going to try to make the document vanish, as if it had never existed. She stared at the wording. Irregularities. Misrepresentation. They were dancing around the accusation of forgery without fully saying it. She reached for the memo again. The same memo with Langston's signature. She knew it was real. She remembered the day she filed it. She remembered walking it down the hall to records because HR didn't have time that week. She remembered Langston's offhand comment about how much she kept this place running. She remembered everything. She sat down at her kitchen table. No papers this time. Just her phone, the list of dates she'd scribbled into the margin of a spiral notebook, and the number for a former coworker, Charles Nguyen, an old operations manager who'd retired shortly after her quiet removal. She hadn't spoken to him in 8 years. She stared at the number. Her finger hovered, then she pressed call. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Slightly hoarse, but unmistakably Charles. "Hello? Charles, it's Elaine. Elaine Shepherd." There was a pause. Then, "Well, I'll be damned. Elaine. You still in Boston?" "I am. Been years. I thought you moved." "No. Just disappeared from the company, I guess." Another pause. "I remember that," he said, his voice low. "HR never told us what happened. I always figured something wasn't right." "I'm in court now," she said. "Trying to prove I was wrongfully removed." Charles didn't respond right away. "I found a memo," she continued. "One that confirms my employment, with Langston's signature on it." Another beat of silence. "I remember that memo," Charles said. Elaine's breath caught. "You do?" "I signed off on the routing. I even made a photocopy. I kept it, somewhere. I don't throw things away. Would you be willing to talk about it? Maybe, testify?" Charles exhaled long and slow. "You always were the backbone of that place." "Yeah. I'll help you." Elaine closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against her hand. Something inside her loosened. I don't want revenge, she whispered. I know, he said. You want the truth. And the truth is, you were never just a secretary. The courthouse looked different the second time. Not in its architecture, that was still all sterile marble, echoing halls, and fluorescent lights. But something had shifted in Elaine. She noticed the details more sharply now. The over-polished floor. The disinterested security guards. The slight smirk on the clerk's face when he handed her the updated docket. Looks like your case just got reassigned, the clerk said, handing her a stapled sheet. Elaine blinked. Reassigned? He tapped the page. Judge Langston filed a recusal this morning. Conflict of interest. Her eyes moved to the name typed below his, Judge Renata Coleman. The clerk didn't look up, already turning to the next person in line. Elaine stepped aside and stared at the paper. The courtroom number had changed. So had the judge, but not the stakes. Langston had seen the memo. That much was clear. Recusing himself was the safest option, and possibly his only one. But it came with another layer of implications. If he had nothing to hide, why step down? She called Tamara from the courthouse steps. Wait, Tamara said. He recused himself? Today. That's huge. Elaine sat on a stone bench, her folder in her lap again like a shield. It is, but it also means the corporate attorneys will push harder. Now they're on alert. Tamara's voice was firm. Then you push back. Elaine looked up. Boston's summer humidity clung to the air, thick and pressing. A distant siren wailed somewhere down Tremont Street. Life kept moving, fast and impersonal. But inside Elaine, something slower was happening, a realignment. Her world was no longer built around shrinking to fit. That night, Elaine pulled out an old external hard drive from her closet. It was from her time at Levon and Harlan. She'd used it to back up her own work, quietly and methodically, after a near loss during a system crash in 2009. She had been told to wipe it when she left. But no one formally offboarded her. No email. No exit interview. Just silence. She connected the drive to her laptop. The screen flickered, and then folders appeared. Dozens of them. She scrolled through client names, project numbers, internal audits. One folder was labeled HR, internal memos. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad. Inside were scanned documents, PDFs, and inter-office email printouts. She recognized some of them instantly: staffing requests, departmental transfers, redundancy, warnings. All of it standard. But tucked between two budget reports was a file she didn't remember saving. The title was vague, memo_retention 3.pdf. She opened it, the document loaded slowly. It was a memo dated June 2011, a few months before things began to unravel. It outlined a change in record retention policy, specifically stating that long-tenured administrative staff without active contracts could be reclassified for asset restructuring purposes. The language was clinical. But the implication was clear: they had quietly redefined roles like hers out of existence. Her name wasn't on the memo, but Langston's was. Again, he hadn't signed this one, but he'd been CC'd as legal oversight. Elaine stared at the screen. Her chest felt tight. She didn't know whether to cry or scream. This wasn't just about being forgotten. It was coordinated. Maybe not aimed solely at her, but she'd been swallowed by it nonetheless. The next court date arrived quickly. Judge Renata Coleman was nothing like Langston. She was in her late 50s, direct, and visibly unimpressed by the defense team's tone. She asked firm questions. Expected clean answers. Elaine appreciated that. Still, when the defense team submitted the motion questioning the authenticity of the first memo, Coleman took it seriously. I'll need a witness who can verify this document's origin and handling, she said, eyes on Elaine. Otherwise, its evidentiary value remains limited. Elaine nodded. I've contacted someone. Charles Nguyen. He's willing to testify. Coleman glanced at her clerk. Set a hearing for preliminary witness statements. 1 week. The gavel tapped lightly. Elaine left the courtroom without looking back. Later that afternoon, she met Charles at a coffee shop just outside Quincy Market. He looked older, thinner, but still sharp. He brought a manila folder with him, old school, like her. I couldn't believe I still had it, he said, placing it on the table. Buried in a box with tax documents and old manuals. Elaine opened the folder. There it was, a photocopy of the same memo she'd submitted. Slightly blurred, with a handwritten note in Charles's pen: routing confirmed, ES signed delivery. She traced her own initials. It was unmistakable. Charles stirred his coffee. You know, he said, when they phased you out, I started watching what I signed more closely. They changed how they did things. Quietly. A lot of folks just disappeared from org charts. Elaine looked up. Why didn't anyone say anything? They made us feel like it wasn't our place. And truthfully, a lot of us just didn't want to risk our own positions. I regret that. You're here now. He nodded. Because? I should have been then. That night, Elaine placed Charles's copy in a new folder. A fresh one. Clean, labeled in neat handwriting, verified exhibits. She made tea, sat at her small kitchen table, and pressed record on the voice recorder. Again, July 14th, she said softly. They tried to say I made it up. But Charles kept the copy. Maybe the past doesn't vanish as easily as they think. Maybe people remember more than they admit. She looked out the window. A soft breeze stirred the blinds. I'm not trying to punish them. I'm trying to name what happened. Click, the recorder went silent. But Elaine wasn't, she was just getting started. The courtroom was fuller this time. Elaine noticed it before the hearing even began, the soft rustle of extra coats, the shuffle of unfamiliar shoes along the tile floor, and the occasional cough from the gallery. She turned her head slightly and saw a row of people seated behind the defense table. Corporate observers. Possibly HR from Levon and Harlan. Maybe even internal legal counsel sent to watch the temperature of the case. They hadn't expected her to last this long. Judge Coleman entered promptly at 9 a.m., her tone brisk, her demeanor unchanged. She didn't look at Elaine with pity, or at the defense with deference. She simply sat and presided. That, in itself, was rare enough. Today, she said clearly, we'll hear the testimony of one Charles Nguyen, called by the plaintiff to verify the authenticity of Exhibit A. Charles stepped forward, calm but visibly stiff in the suit he'd probably worn to weddings and retirement dinners. Elaine could see his hands trembling slightly as he was sworn in. State your name for the record. Charles Min Nguyen. And your former role at Levon and Harlan? I was operations manager from 2006 to 2015. And your relationship to the plaintiff? I worked closely with Ms. Shepard. She coordinated multiple departments I oversaw. I reviewed and signed routing slips for a number of internal documents she managed. Elaine sat motionless at her table, heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment the defense feared, and the moment she needed. The defense attorney, a sharply dressed man with an easy confidence, stood. Mr. Nguyen, you claim to have a copy of a memo from 2011 that includes the plaintiff's initials. Is that correct? Yes. Where did you store this document for over a decade? In a personal file box. I retained copies of certain documents out of caution, not as an act of defiance. It was routine for me. The attorney smiled tightly. So you routinely kept confidential corporate documents at home? I routinely kept my copies of items I signed off on, Charles replied evenly. And this memo was not marked classified. Or proprietary. It was administrative. The lawyer shifted. Can you say with absolute certainty that this is the same document Ms. Shepard submitted as Exhibit A? I can. The copy I brought today includes a handwritten note in my own pen, dated the same week, verifying delivery. Judge Coleman leaned forward. May I see the document again? Charles handed the page to the bailiff. It made its slow journey up to the bench. Elaine glanced at the defense table. For the first time, she saw a flicker of concern on the lead attorney's face. The judge studied the document silently. This note, routing confirmed, ES signed delivery, that's your handwriting? Yes, Your Honor. And was it standard practice for you to annotate routing slips in this way? It was. Especially when staff handled cross-departmental communications without HR's direct involvement. Judge Coleman leaned back. The document is admitted. Motion to dismiss it as inadmissible is denied. Elaine exhaled slowly. Her eyes closed for half a second. The gallery was dead quiet. The defense attorney stood again. Your Honor, we reserve the right to challenge the credibility of this testimony in closing. Duly noted, Coleman said. But the document stands for now. Outside, after the hearing, Charles stood beside Elaine on the courthouse steps. The sky was heavy with low clouds, and the light was muted, almost pewter in color. Neither of them spoke at first. You okay? Charles finally asked. Elaine nodded. Thank you for doing that. He shrugged. I owed you. You didn't. But I'm grateful. Charles looked out at the traffic passing along the street, then back at her. They're not going to stop now, you know. They'll try other ways to discredit you. Your finances, your mental health, your memory. Elaine's lips tightened. I've read the tactics. He gave a small, tired laugh. Then you're ahead of where I was when I left. That evening, back at home, Elaine sat on the floor of her apartment, her folders fanned out in semicircles around her. Some were labeled, some weren't. But all of them were parts of a life no one at Levon and Harlan had expected her to hold on to. She found the old company newsletter from March 2012, the one that had a photo of her team after securing a major logistics contract. Her name had been in the caption. Her face, right there in the middle. Proof of her contribution, but what caught her off guard was something else, a quote printed underneath. Every engine has someone who keeps it running quietly. The quote had been attributed to Langston. Elaine stared at it for a long time, and back then, it had felt like a compliment. Now, it felt like an admission. She recorded again that night, July 17th, she said softly into the recorder. Charles testified. The judge believed him. They didn't expect this. They still don't. But the more I look through these files, the more I see how carefully I was erased, and how quietly I had to exist for so long. She paused, fingers grazing the edge of the newsletter. Langston knew. He knew my name. He knew what I did. And when they removed me, he didn't stop them. Click. The next morning, she received a notice via certified mail. A new filing from the defense, a motion to compel disclosure of medical records. Elaine's stomach dropped. They were moving into personal territory now, aiming to frame her as mentally unstable, possibly unfit, perhaps unreliable in memory. It was a sharp, cruel pivot, but one that didn't surprise her. She stared at the envelope, then, with calm precision, she opened her laptop and began to draft a statement for the judge. They wanted to question her mind. She would answer with clarity, not rage. Not fear. Just truth, because the woman they'd dismissed wasn't trembling anymore. The letter sat unopened on the kitchen table for 2 days. Elaine couldn't bring herself to read the full motion at first. She had seen the title, Motion to Compel Disclosure of Medical Records. That was enough. She didn't need a lawyer to understand what it meant. They were trying to redefine her again, this time, not as someone who never existed, but as someone who couldn't be trusted to recall her own life, someone unstable, emotionally compromised, maybe even delusional. The message was clear: if they couldn't erase her, they'd discredit her. Tamara came over on the third evening, arms full with takeout and her usual steel-eyed practicality. You need to read it, she said, setting the bags down. Then, we decide how to respond. Elaine opened the envelope slowly, hand steady despite the weight in her chest. She read each word carefully, and then read them again. The defense attorneys were requesting full disclosure of her mental health history, citing reasonable concern regarding the plaintiff's ability to accurately recall events from more than a decade ago. They included vague references to her withdrawal from public life and lack of formal employment since 2013. They were building a story, and this time, Elaine was the character, not the narrator. You ever see a doctor? Tamara asked gently. Elaine hesitated. After they let me go, I started getting migraines. I saw a neurologist. They found nothing. And a therapist? Elaine nodded. For a while. I wasn't depressed, not clinically. But I was disoriented. Like someone had shut the lights off in a room I used to know by heart. Tamara listened, her fork paused midair. I had no income. I had no letters saying I was fired. No explanation to give unemployment or recruiters. It was like I just evaporated off paper. Tamara leaned forward. You were gaslit on a corporate level. Of course your brain rebelled. Elaine smiled weakly. That's not a diagnosis they list in medical records. The next morning, Elaine went to the courthouse early to file her formal response. She had printed a letter, concise but firm. I consent to partial disclosure of medical records related to neurological evaluations between 2013 to 2014. No mental health diagnoses were made. I reserve the right to protect records unrelated to the matter at hand. It wasn't just a legal strategy, it was a boundary. One of many she'd never been allowed to draw while working quietly behind closed doors for over a decade. The clerk accepted the paperwork without comment. Elaine left the courthouse with the July heat pressing heavily against her skin. On her way back to the T station, she passed a woman in her early 60s holding a clipboard, trying to get passers-by to stop. No one did. Elaine slowed for a moment, made eye contact. The woman smiled with exhaustion. Are you registered to vote in Suffolk County? Elaine nodded but didn't stop. She kept walking. That evening, she pulled out another box from the back of her closet. One she hadn't opened in years. Inside were old planners, pocket calendars, and legal pads scrawled with dates, notes, initials. Her days at Levon and Harlan had been documented not just digitally, but in ink, shorthand reminders, meeting summaries, deadlines. She flipped through a notebook from 2011 and found a yellow post-it near the top of one page. TL wants. Sign off before it hits HR. Ask C to reroute. TL. Theodore Langston. C. Charles, the web had always been there. She'd just never expected to need it to defend her own memory. She pressed record that night, her voice steadier than before. July 20th, she said. They're trying to say I imagined it. That I've misremembered everything. But what they don't know is how many things I wrote down. How many details I tucked away out of habit. Not for proof, just to stay organized. But now those notes, they're holding my life together. She stopped, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside her window. I've been unemployed for years. Not because I was incompetent, but because one quiet removal destroyed a chain of reference, proof, continuity. That's all it takes. She clicked off the recorder. The next day, Judge Coleman issued a response to Elaine's filing motion to compel full disclosure, partially denied. The court would allow specific neurological records to be entered under seal, but no psychiatric records, no character evaluations, no exploratory fishing. Elaine sat with the document in her hands for a long time. It wasn't just a procedural win, it was a recognition of dignity, of boundaries. Something she hadn't felt in over a decade. She wrote a short email to Charles, I won this round. They went after my mind. But I remembered too much. That weekend, she took a rare break. No folders. No memos. No calendars. Instead, she visited the public garden and sat on a bench overlooking the small lake, watching children feed ducks and elderly couples stroll by slowly. Life moved gently here, untethered from profit margins and corporate hierarchies. For the first time in weeks, Elaine allowed herself to wonder not just about winning, but about after. What would happen if they ruled in her favor? Would she go back to work? Could she, or would this fight simply restore her name on a paper, a name she already knew by heart? It began with a headline, not in a major outlet. Not the Boston Globe or the Times. Just a local legal blog, one of those niche, quietly influential publications that lawyers and HR professionals read with their morning coffee. The article was titled, Former Legal Secretary Challenges Employer in Landmark Self-Representation Case, Judge's Signature at Center of Evidence. Elaine only found it because Tamara sent her the link at 6:43 a.m. The article didn't mention her name, not yet. But it detailed the facts clearly, a former administrative employee alleging quiet removal from corporate records, a judge's past involvement exposed mid-hearing. A self-represented plaintiff successfully submitting decade-old internal documents into evidence. Elaine read the piece in full before sunrise, sitting in the dark at her kitchen table, the screen's light casting sharp angles across her face. Then she read it again, and again. By mid-morning, she'd received 3 emails from addresses she didn't recognize. One was from a law student asking if she'd be willing to be interviewed for a paper on corporate accountability. Another was from a former colleague at Levon and Harlan. Subject, I saw the article. If you're who I think you are? I'm sorry. There was no name. No number. Just that sentence. She stared at it for a long time. When Elaine arrived at the courthouse 2 days later, something in the air had changed. The clerks looked at her differently, not cruelly, but with that cautious awareness reserved for people who'd been written about. The hallway outside courtroom 4B was fuller than usual. 2 women stood near the wall, speaking in low tones and glancing her way. She smoothed the front of her blouse and kept walking. Inside, the hearing was procedural, just scheduling, clarification of deadlines. But the defense team looked rattled. The younger attorney fumbled with his paperwork. The older one avoided eye contact. The firm had been named in the article. Even if Elaine hadn't, Judge Coleman called the session to order. I understand there's now public interest in this case, she said, her tone neutral. Let me be clear, proceedings will remain professional, and decorum is expected. Elaine nodded. The defense said nothing. After court adjourned, she passed the 2 women again on her way out. One of them, tall with a dark blazer and sensible shoes, stepped forward. Miss Shepherd, she asked quietly. Elaine froze. I'm sorry, the woman said quickly. My name is Annette. I used to work in payroll. We never spoke much, but I remember you. Everyone did. Elaine's voice caught. You were in the office on the 2nd floor. Yes. I'm not with them anymore. Left in 2018. She hesitated, glancing around. If you ever need a statement about how things shifted in HR back then, how certain files were being restructured off the system, I can tell you what I saw. Elaine's throat tightened. I might. Annette handed her a folded card. I wrote my number down. You don't have to call. Just, I wanted you to know, some of us remember. Elaine held the card in her hand long after the woman was gone. Later that night, she spoke into her recorder again. July 24th, she said. Someone I never spoke to offered to testify. Because she remembers a version of me they tried to delete. She stopped, thinking, I've been fighting so long to prove I existed. Now, pieces of the past are finding me on their own. The following week, the defense filed a motion to introduce character witnesses, 3 current employees at Levon and Harlan who would testify to the firm's robust documentation practices and lack of knowledge regarding the plaintiff's employment status at time of departure. It was, transparently, damage control. Elaine scanned the names. She recognized all 3. One of them, Josephine Meyer, had trained under her for 3 years. Elaine had taught her how to flag incomplete routing slips, how to detect when an executive memo had been rewritten mid-approval, how to use institutional memory as leverage. Josephine was sharp, eager, and clearly willing to forget where she'd come from. Elaine read the filing 3 times, then sat in silence. Tamara called that night, voice taut. They're circling wagons. Elaine answered quietly. They're building a version of me. That never touched anything. But you're ready, Tamara said. And now they're reacting. That's what people do when they're afraid of the truth. The next hearing would be the first with formal witness testimony on both sides. Elaine knew the room would be full, not because of press, but because people were watching now, quietly, carefully, to see what would happen when someone who'd been erased refused to stay invisible. She spent the weekend preparing, going over timelines, revisiting her handwritten notes from 2011 to 2013. She lined everything up in labeled folders, as if she were still managing someone else's department, but this time, she was her own project, her own defense. On Monday morning, Elaine stood in front of the mirror for a long time. She wore a deep navy suit, not new, but well kept, with a pale blue blouse underneath. Her hair was pinned back neatly. Her shoes were polished. She looked like someone who belonged at the front of the room, someone who had never left it. She stepped into the courthouse with a fresh folder in her hand. It had no company logo, just her initials, written carefully at the top. ES, because sometimes claiming your name again is the beginning of everything. The courtroom felt colder than usual. Elaine sat in her now familiar spot at the plaintiff's table, her folder neatly squared beside her, spine straight despite the weight of what was about to happen. She'd learned the rhythm of the room. When to stand, when to speak, how long to hold a silence. She no longer looked at the judge with the wide-eyed uncertainty of someone begging to be heard. Now, she simply waited. The court officer called the first witness, Josephine Meyer. Elaine's eyes flicked toward the door. Josephine entered with a confident, practiced stride. She was in her early 30s now, her hair in a sleek ponytail, her suit tailored to perfection. She took the oath quickly, like she'd done this before. Elaine hadn't seen her in over a decade, and yet, she remembered everything. Josephine's first day. Her nervous questions. The extra time Elaine took explaining how to manage overlapping department requests without losing track of signatures. The way Josephine had once left her a sticky note that read, "Thanks for being patient, most people aren't." None of that mattered now. The defense attorney stood. Ms. Meyer, can you confirm your current position at Levon and Harlan? I'm a senior compliance manager. And how long have you been with the company? Since 2010. The attorney nodded. In your experience, does the firm maintain accurate, secure records of employment and internal documentation? Yes. We operate under strict retention protocols, especially post-2009. And are you familiar with any record of employment, direct or indirect, for an Elaine Shepard during your time at the company? Josephine paused for a half-second. It was enough for Elaine to catch it, the subtle, deliberate breath. No. I've reviewed department logs from 2010 to 2013. Her name does not appear. Elaine felt something inside her sink. Not out of shock, but recognition. She'd seen this before. People choosing silence. Choosing survival, but this wasn't just omission. This was rewriting. The attorney continued. Do you recall any interactions with Ms. Shepard during your employment? Another pause. Not directly. I may have seen the name, but I never worked under her. Elaine's hand tensed on the edge of the table. Not directly. Never worked under her. It was a carefully constructed truth, one that erased years of informal mentorship, late-night edits, training manuals Elaine had built that Josephine had inherited. When the defense finished, Judge Coleman turned to Elaine. Would you like to cross-examine Ms. Shepard? Elaine stood slowly. She walked to the front with quiet composure, her folder in hand. Josephine wouldn't look at her. Elaine opened the folder. She removed a document, not a memo, not a spreadsheet. Just a photo. Ms. Meyer, she said gently, can you confirm that this is the Employee Appreciation Luncheon from 2012? Josephine glanced at it briefly. I believe so. Elaine handed the second copy to the court. Your Honor, I'd like to admit this into evidence. The image contains a seating chart attached to the back. Names were labeled by the department head, at the time, myself. Judge Coleman examined the image. Elaine turned back to Josephine. Do you see your name on that chart? Yes. Do you see mine? Josephine hesitated. Yes. Is it listed above yours? Yes. Why? Josephine's voice faltered for the first time. Because, you were in an administrative leadership role. And yet today, you testified that you did not work under me. Which version would you like the court to believe? Josephine said nothing. Elaine didn't push further. She turned to the judge. No further questions. She returned to her seat. Her hands weren't trembling. But her heart was heavy. She hadn't done it to win. She'd done it to name what was happening, how women who rise quietly are erased just as quietly. How loyalty is optional when truth becomes inconvenient. That evening, Tamara came over with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. Elaine poured it slowly. She didn't lie, Elaine said. Not technically. But she erased me. In front of everyone. Tamara. Took a sip. They teach us how to do that. Not in meetings, not in manuals, but in practice. Reward the forgetful. Promote the silent. Elaine nodded. Do you think it made her sick to say it? Tamara shrugged. It doesn't matter. She said it. Later that night, Elaine sat at her desk, the courtroom transcript printed out and highlighted. She had underlined her own question, which version would you like the court to believe? That wasn't just for Josephine. That was for the firm. The judge. The world for herself. She clicked on the recorder. July 29th, she whispered. They've begun telling their version of me. But I still have mine. And mine has dates. Memos. People. Rooms. She paused, looking at the photo again. The seating chart. Her name typed just above Josephine's. They can change the story, she said. But they can't change the paper. The next court date would be her turn, not cross-examination, testimony, under oath. Elaine closed the folder, tucked the photo inside, then she picked up a pen, and began writing everything she remembered. In her own hand, for the record. Elaine stepped into the witness box with a quiet resolve that felt foreign, and earned. She stood straight, her chin lifted, but not with defiance. With readiness. The court officer swore her in, and as she repeated the words, the truth. The whole truth, and nothing but the truth, her voice didn't tremble. She sat down. Adjusted the microphone. Judge Coleman nodded. You may proceed, Miss Shepherd. Elaine took a breath. She didn't need to look at her notes. My name is Elaine Shepherd. I'm 56 years old. I was employed at Levon and Harlan, officially, from 2004 to 2013. Unofficially, I was there longer, mentally, emotionally, even after they deleted my name from every system that used to recognize me. No one interrupted. I was hired as an executive secretary. But within the first year, I was asked to coordinate logistical operations between departments. I created new routing systems, maintained compliance checklists, managed interdepartmental memos, and often served as an unofficial liaison between staff and in-house legal. She looked across the courtroom, not at the defense table, not at the lawyers, but at the gallery. At the strangers who'd come to watch a story that didn't belong on the front page. One that belonged in someone's inbox 10 years ago. I wasn't fired. I wasn't laid off. I wasn't even told. My position was ending. One morning, my login failed. My calendar was wiped. My keycard wouldn't scan. HR said there was no record of termination because there was no record of me. She turned back to Judge Coleman. That's how erasure works. Not loudly. Quietly. Silently. In digital silence, you cease to exist. The courtroom was utterly still. The defense attorney rose. Miss Shepherd, can you tell the court why you waited nearly a decade to bring this claim forward? Elaine didn't blink. Because it took me nearly a decade to believe I had the right to. He paced slowly. But you had no contract, no W-2 after 2013, no formal complaints filed with HR prior to your departure. Do you admit that? I do. Then how do you explain your continued belief that you were employed during that time? Elaine opened her folder, slowly, deliberately. She withdrew a short stack of stapled papers. Because I have documentation of active responsibilities assigned to me, as late as August 2013. I have emails requesting departmental reports, meeting invites, and my own notes, handwritten, of daily operations. She placed the papers on the table. And because I remember. The lawyer smiled thinly. Memory is not always reliable, Miss Shepherd. No, she said calmly. But patterns are. He paused. Elaine continued. It wasn't just my memory. It was my rhythm. The rhythm of arriving before 8 a.m., of fixing someone else's calendar at 9:12, of resolving a missing sign-off at 2:40, of cleaning up someone's mistake without credit at 5:10. Every day. For years. She looked at the judge again. You don't forget that rhythm. Even when it disappears, your body remembers. The defense attorney adjusted his tone. Did you ever report your employment concerns to a labor board, or consult with legal counsel? I did. And I was told it would be difficult to prove anything without a termination letter or pay stubs. And since I had neither, I was told to move on. But you didn't. Elaine looked him in the eye. No. I collected. I archived. I watched. I waited for the moment someone in power would slip, and acknowledge I existed. The courtroom shifted, a collective stillness pressing in. Judge Coleman spoke next. Miss Shepherd, what is it that you're asking this court to recognize? Elaine answered without pause. That I worked. That I was present. That I gave 13 years of my life to a company that erased me without explanation. That my name belonged in their records. That I wasn't crazy. That I wasn't a ghost. That I mattered. She stopped. And that when I opened that folder, And showed Judge Langston his own signature, the one he placed on a memo acknowledging my authority. He laughed first. But he didn't laugh after. Silence, not even a shuffle of paper. After Elaine's testimony ended, she stepped down slowly and returned to her seat. Her legs were stiff, but her spine was straight. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer release of speaking aloud what had lived in her alone for too long. Tamara met her outside the courtroom that afternoon. "You owned the room," she whispered. "I didn't want to." Elaine said. Tamara nodded. "But you had to." That evening, Elaine sat at her desk again. The courtroom transcript, still incomplete, had yet to be published. But the words were fresh in her mind. She clicked the recorder on. August 1st. She said, "I told them. All of it. I didn't shake. I didn't fold. I remembered everything. And maybe the court won't rule in my favor. Maybe the firm will still find a way to say it didn't happen like that. But I said it. And someone wrote it down. And now, it's real, not just to me, but to the world." She looked at the empty space beside her desk. I existed. Click. Elaine had always thought the hardest part would be speaking, but it wasn't. The hardest part was what came after. She hadn't expected the transcript to circulate so quickly. But within 3 days, it had. Someone, likely one of the legal bloggers who had begun quietly following the case, had quoted excerpts online. Just a few lines. No commentary. Just words. "You don't forget that rhythm. Even when it disappears, your body remembers. I wasn't a ghost. I mattered." It spread, quietly at first. Then less quietly. Elaine got an email from a stranger. Then 3. Then 12. Not all from Boston. Some from Chicago. Some from Oakland. One from North Carolina. All different names, different jobs, but the same message. "I know what it feels like to be erased." One woman wrote, "Your voice gave shape to something I never had language for." Elaine didn't reply. Not yet. But she read every word. She hadn't planned to be a symbol. She hadn't even planned to be seen. All she had wanted, was for her name to be put back where it had been erased. But now, something larger was unfolding. And it wasn't entirely in her control. The defense noticed, too. The next filing came swiftly, a motion to strike portions of the plaintiff's testimony as emotionally charged and prejudicial. They claimed her words, though moving, were designed to sway the court through sympathy rather than fact. Elaine read the motion twice. Tamara read it once and scoffed. Of course they did. They know they're losing the audience. It's not a performance, Elaine said quietly. No, Tamara replied. But they've always seen it as one. They just didn't expect you to steal the stage. That same week, Elaine received a message through her case email. The one she'd created specifically for the trial. It was from a man named Eric Blass, a former junior partner at Levon and Harlan. He wrote, "I left the firm 5 years ago. I wasn't brave enough to speak then. But if this goes to deposition, and you need someone to confirm how internal restructuring decisions were made, especially how certain administrative staff were classified, I will speak." Elaine sat with the message for a full hour. She remembered Eric. He had never been cruel. He had also never been visible, but people were beginning to surface now, like silt stirred up from the bottom of a long still river. Judge Coleman responded to the motion quickly. "The court will not strike the plaintiff's testimony. Personal experience is not inadmissible simply because it is moving." Elaine printed the ruling and pinned it above her desk. She said nothing out loud, but her hand steadied more quickly now. 3 nights later, she went to a local panel on corporate labor practices, mostly out of curiosity, partly to step out of the echo of her apartment. It was held in a community center downtown. Fluorescent lights, lukewarm coffee in styrofoam cups, a folding table for speakers. Nothing flashy. She arrived late and slipped into the back row. One of the panelists, a soft-spoken woman from a non-profit legal aid office, mentioned her case in passing. Not by name. Just the details. The judge's signature. The erased records. The voice that remembered too much. No one in the room turned, but someone 3 rows ahead whispered, "I read that transcript." Elaine sat very still. She hadn't expected the world to care. Not really. But now, quietly, it seemed to, and that was more terrifying than silence ever had been. The firm noticed again. A second corporate attorney joined the defense. Older, stiffer. Brought in, it seemed, to contain what the first couldn't. He filed a new strategy memo, sealed, but leaked, requesting minimization tactics for further proceedings. They'd stop challenging her directly and start questioning the validity of her relevance. The plaintiff's employment, even if proven, may have been administrative in nature and not tied to the internal decisions in question. Our position should shift to one of structural distancing. Elaine read that phrase twice. Structural distancing. They couldn't erase her anymore. So they'd try to shrink her back at her apartment, she sat in front of her recorder. August 6th, she said, they said my testimony was too emotional. That it swayed the room unfairly. But I've been in rooms my whole life where I didn't sway anyone. Where I said everything clearly and still got ignored. She paused, fingers touching the corner of her notebook. I wasn't asking for tears. I was asking to be seen. I think people confuse the two. Click. The next court date was scheduled for 10 days later, a procedural session, but likely the last before pretrial settlement talks. Elaine knew the firm wanted it to end before. Then, she could feel it in the filings, in the sudden influx of outside counsel, in the tightening of their language. They were ready to pay, perhaps, but not to admit, not to say we did this. She stood by her window that night, the city flickering. Outside, she thought of all the versions of herself that had walked into that building for over a decade, quiet, capable, invisible. And all the versions that left, one morning, with no goodbye, no paper trail, no closure. She thought of the folders she had opened, of the names that had started to remember, of the silence that had begun to break, and for the first time since this started, Elaine allowed herself to ask, what happens if I win, not in spirit, but legally? Publicly? Irrevocably? What would justice actually look like, and would it be enough? It arrived on a Wednesday. Elaine was in the laundry room of her building when she saw the email notification. A quiet ping from the case account on her phone. She left the basket half-folded and stood near the humming dryer, her thumb hovering over the screen. Subject: Confidential Settlement Proposal, Shepard vs. Levon and Harlan Incorporated. She stared at it. Then opened it. The email was brief. Polite. Legally cautious. In the interest of avoiding prolonged litigation and reputational damage, our client is prepared to offer the following terms. What followed was a list, a financial settlement, not token, but not life-changing. An acknowledgement of her employment from 2004 to 2013, included in her personnel file. No public admission of wrongdoing. No reinstatement of records. Beyond internal HR systems. A strict non-disclosure clause. Elaine read it 3 times. Not because she didn't understand it, but because she did. This was their version of peace, silence for a price. Visibility returned, but only in the basement of some HR server. She called Tamara. They're offering to say I was there, Elaine said. But only if I agree not to say why they tried to make it look like I wasn't. Tamara didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, it's not an apology. It's a transaction. Elaine nodded. They're not admitting harm. Just history. And you'd have to bury your voice again. Elaine sat down at her small dining table. The surface was scattered with notes, transcripts, half-drunk teacups. It looked like a woman lived there now, not a ghost. I don't want to stay angry, Elaine said. But I don't want to disappear again, either. That night, she didn't sleep. She went for a walk after midnight, the streets slick from a brief rain. She passed shuttered storefronts, dark windows, and parking meters that blinked red. She found herself standing outside a building she hadn't seen in years, the old Levon and Harlan office. The signage had changed slightly. A few lights were still on inside, glowing sterile against the glass. She stood across the street, staring up at the 4th floor. Her old floor. She remembered the desk layout. The chipped corner of the copy room door. The sound the 3rd elevator made when it reached the top. She had once memorized everything inside that building. And they had counted on her forgetting it. The next day, Judge Coleman scheduled a conference call with both parties. Elaine joined from her apartment. The firm's attorneys dialed in with perfectly timed greetings. The judge's voice cut through the line. I understand a settlement has been proposed. Yes, Your Honor, said the senior defense attorney. We believe this resolution serves both parties and avoids unnecessary court congestion. Elaine unmuted herself. With respect, she said, I don't agree. Silence. Judge Coleman's voice was measured. Ms. Shepard, can you clarify your position? Elaine spoke clearly, calmly. I'm not here for money. I'm here because I was erased. And being quietly reinstated behind a firewall doesn't restore that. I want my name back publicly. I want acknowledgement on record. Not hidden in sealed agreements. The defense attorney tried to interject, but Coleman raised a hand. Even on the screen, it was commanding. Let her finish. Elaine inhaled. I'll settle, she said, if the firm publicly acknowledges that I was removed from records. Without cause. That my employment was valid, continuous, and terminated without formal process. No need for blame. Just truth. She paused. And I will not sign a non-disclosure. Judge Coleman looked at the camera for a long moment. This is a fair counteroffer, she said. Mr. Klein, I suggest you discuss it with your client before rejecting it outright. The call ended shortly after. Elaine sat in silence. Then, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. 2 days later, the firm responded. No counterargument. No legal threats. Just this, under advisement from counsel, Levon and Harlan Incorporated is prepared to acknowledge that Ms. Elaine Shepard's employment from 2004 to 2013 was valid, continuous, and improperly terminated without formal process or documentation. We recognize that our internal systems failed to maintain accurate records. We regret the impact this had on Ms. Shepard's professional standing. No apology, but no denial either, and most importantly, no silence. Elaine stood at her window. That evening, rereading the statement, Tamara had sent balloons. Her inbox was full again, strangers, former coworkers, even 2 reporters. She hadn't decided what she'd do next. If she'd speak publicly. Right. Advocate. Retreat, but as she sipped her tea, she allowed herself one moment of stillness. One moment where she said, aloud, to no one in particular, I was right. I was never gone. And the city kept moving. Beneath her window, slow, alive, and full of other names waiting to be remembered. No balloons. No confetti. No headline banner across her apartment window. Elaine woke the morning after the firm's official acknowledgement to the sound of her neighbor's dog barking at the garbage truck. Ordinary noise. She sat up slowly, unsure. Whether she felt lighter or heavier, she had won, at least on paper. Her name had been restored. The firm had acknowledged what they once denied. There was no more denying that she had been there, every day, for nearly a decade. And yet, instead of relief pouring in, she felt vacant. A kind of quiet that wasn't peace. Not yet. She went to the library, like she had so many mornings before. Not because she needed to research anymore, but because routine still made more sense than stillness. The librarian, a woman Elaine knew only by face and rhythm, stopped her at the front desk. I saw your name, she said quietly. In that article. About the case. Elaine froze. The woman continued, I read what they did. And what you said in court. It mattered. Just wanted you to know that. Elaine nodded. She wanted to say something meaningful in return, something that marked the moment, but all she could manage was, thank you. That means more than you know. She walked past the desk, unsure if she was more moved or unsettled by being recognized not for what she had done, but for what she had endured. That afternoon, she opened her inbox again. The emails kept coming. A law professor wanted permission to include a summary of her case in a curriculum module. A podcast producer asked if she would be willing to talk. A young woman who worked in administrative support at a private university wrote, I think I might be disappearing like you were. I'm watching them change systems, reassign projects, and suddenly no one sees me. But I'm still here. Thank you for saying it out loud first. Elaine closed her laptop slowly. There was a time when all she wanted was to be heard. Now that she wasn't sure she wanted the echo. Tamara came by that evening with groceries and silence, the kind friends carry without needing permission. They made tea. Feels different, Tamara said, pouring hot water into mismatched mugs. It should, Elaine replied. But mostly it just feels, paused. Not empty? Elaine thought for a long moment. No. Just, quiet in a new way. Tamara nodded. You ever think about what you want now? I mean, after all this? Elaine looked around her apartment. At the neat stacks of folders now boxed and labeled and sealed. At the recorder she hadn't touched in days. At the half-finished list of people she still wanted to thank. I think I want to write something, she said. Not for court. Not for record. Just, for me. Tamara raised her cup. Then you should. The next morning, Elaine walked to a small bookstore on Beacon Hill. It was the kind of place where time moved slowly and dust added charm. She found a thick notebook, cloth-bound, lined, with a soft navy cover. She bought it without hesitation. At home, she opened the first page and wrote, Things I Remember. Then she began, not a memoir. Not a case study, just pieces, of rooms, people, sentences that had once made her feel real. The smell of the office on Monday mornings. The sound of someone tapping a pen too hard during meetings. The joke a coworker once made in the elevator that only she laughed at. She didn't write to prove anything, she wrote because, now, she could point. 3 days later, she received a letter in the mail. Handwritten. No return address. It read, I saw your story. I used to work under Langston, too. He wasn't just part of what happened to you. He was part of what happened to a lot of us. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. There was a phone number. That was all. Elaine folded the letter and placed it in the back of her notebook. Not everything had to be responded to immediately. Some things needed to sit, to ripen in the quiet. That night, she recorded a message again, August 10th. She said softly. There's no court tomorrow. No filings. No one waiting for my documents or my voice. And I don't know what justice is supposed to feel like. But I know what injustice felt like. And this is not that. She paused. I'm not erased anymore. I'm unfinished. And that feels more human than anything I've felt in years. Click, the news cycle had moved on. A new case. A scandal in City Hall. A sudden heatwave, but Elaine's name, the one they once removed, now sat on public record. In transcripts. In articles. In someone's law school syllabus, and most of all, in her own handwriting, in a cloth-bound book on her desk. She hadn't just survived the silence, she had rewritten the ending. Autumn arrived early in Boston that year. By the second week of September, the air had turned crisp. Mornings were quiet and golden, leaves beginning to whisper their changes before they fell. Elaine walked to the library wearing a soft gray scarf. And carrying a canvas tote with her notebook inside. It was her third visit this week, not to research or print motions, but to write. She had claimed a corner table near the window. The same one where she'd once scanned documents in silence, wondering if she was losing her mind. Now, she simply sat there with a pen and a sense of self she never thought she'd recover. The case was officially closed. Levon and Harlan had complied with the agreement. Her name was restored in their records, and the public acknowledgement now sat on file in both court and company documents. There would be no trial. No headlines, but also, no gag order. Elaine had kept her voice, her inbox had quieted. The podcast producer had followed up again, more gently this time, offering to record on your terms, if ever. The professor had shared a PDF of the curriculum module her story now appeared in, alongside a small note. You are helping future professionals understand what silence costs. Elaine had printed it. Not to frame. Just to remember. One afternoon. She visited the Boston Women's Archive. She'd read online that they accepted story submissions, letters, journals, reflections, from women across Massachusetts. No credentials required. Just lived truth. She brought a sealed envelope, labeled simply, Shepherd, Elaine, personal testimony. Inside were three things: a printed copy of her courtroom statement, a page from her notebook titled, On the Record, a photo from the company luncheon in 2012, names labeled, the archivist, a soft-spoken grad student, asked her if she wanted to include a brief biography. Elaine thought for a moment, then wrote on the submission slip, Administrative Coordinator, Levon and Harlan Incorporated, 2004 to 2013. Advocate for professional visibility. Not erased. Weeks passed. Then a month. The noise faded, not into erasure, but into continuity. A new chapter. A quieter one. Elaine took on part-time work at a nonprofit, helping with internal documentation and policy organization. They didn't know her full story, not at first. But they saw her clearly. They valued precision, memory, clarity. She didn't need to prove she belonged, she just did. One morning, she sat on a bench near the public garden with her notebook open. The leaves had turned. Children laughed in the distance, chasing ducks that refused to be chased. A jogger passed with music leaking from their headphones. The ordinary rhythm of life, no longer excluding her. She turned to a fresh page and wrote, I am not what they tried to bury. I am what I kept. And I kept everything. Later that evening, she recorded what would be her final message. The recorder clicked softly in her hand, familiar now, but unnecessary. She didn't need the reassurance of playback anymore. Still, she wanted to mark the moment. October 3rd, she said gently. It's quiet now. Not because they silenced me. Because I no longer need to shout. The record exists. The story was told. Not edited by someone else. Not hidden under someone else's version. A pause. If someone finds this recorder one day, let them know I was here. And I said everything I meant to say. Click. Elaine didn't become famous. She didn't start a foundation. She didn't write a memoir, but one spring morning, her name appeared, alphabetically, quietly, in a footnote of a journal article titled, The Administrative Backbone, Invisible Labor in the American Workplace. And somewhere in the Boston Women's Archive, in a labeled folder, there sits a memo. A photo. A truth too carefully lived to be forgotten. Elaine Shepherd's voice was once laughed at, now, it's on record forever.